It is high time that we as Nintendo fans acknowledge the reality of the situation. Titles like Baldur's Gate 3 and Dispatch are sexually degenerate and they deserve to be censored. I don't want to see sexual content in games. I don't want to hear about it. I don't want to see any argumentation or debate. This was disgusting. This is retarded, and shows like, games like this, games like Baldur's Gate 3 with the bear and the bestiality, shows like South Park, they should absolutely be regulated and controlled. You're not cool by saying and doing things that you're not supposed to be doing. You're not making some profound statement on society. You're not making things better. You are a degenerate. And it is high time that we start acknowledging that certain things should never, ever be depicted in media. And I think with Dispatch, I think with all the sex scenes in film and TV, like, it is time we acknowledge that I am completely and utterly sick of all of it. Like, the only reason that anybody cared about Baldur's Gate 3 at all was the sexual content. If you go back to the early Game of Thrones discussions, the only thing that anyone cared about was the sexual content. When you look at like Mass Effect or any of these other like, early woke products, they are sold to people entirely based on this process, like this idea that like, play the game and you'll get to have sex. Ooh. Like, it's disgusting. It's abhorrent, and it really should be cracked down on. And it seems as if Nintendo is going to be the company that finally says, you know what? We don't want sexually explicit content in our games, Like, if you try to do that, you're just going to get banned, You're going to be censored. You're going to be removed. You're done. You're finished. And so they have decided to heavily censor the degenerate visual novel Dispatch, Like, it's like the Invincible of Invincible, Like, it's like the dark, edgy, like, superhero thing, but like some kind of visual novel. I don't know what Dispatch is, but like the narrative for like a week was that this was the biggest game of 2025, and it's already been forgotten. Like, I don't want to play with you anymore. Like, Dispatch has already been forgotten, and now that Nintendo has censored it, a handful of like terminally online weirdos, people like Smash JT and like those guys, they're trying to come out and say like, oh no, fans aren't going to want to buy this. Like, yeah, the same fans that bought the game already on PlayStation and PC. Like, I don't think this is going to impact sales very much. I think the target audience for this already owns the game. And this is the reality of the situation we're in now, right? Is that we're going to see games like this get heavily censored on Nintendo consoles. And first of all, it's not going to impact their performance very much because Nintendo is so much more popular than the other platforms. But second of all, like, this kind of showcases the double standard, because if Dispatch was genuinely a good game, if it had any real merit whatsoever, like, nobody would care about this. There'd be so much actual content that nobody would be looking at, like, for pubic hair and for like censored scenes. Like, the reality is, like, this is a game that entirely sold itself on being degenerate. It has no real value. It's low quality. It's slop. It very well may have like written by Alan Moore. It's so low quality, lazy, uninspired, basic, pseudo-intellectual Marxist nonsense. Okay, this is on the same level of quality as Watchmen. A comic book that anybody who has picked up an actual novel will tell you is complete and utter trash. Okay, Dispatch is an example of the Watchmen phenomenon. Where people think that, like, oh man, superheroes are being dark and edgy. We would never see this out of Marvel and DC. Like, imagine getting this kind of edgy material from the genre for decades and still saying this. As if this is like some new like progressive thing. Like, the reality is, this kind of material adds nothing to the medium. It doesn't do anything new, inventive, or exciting. It completely misrepresents what the what the comic book genre, medium should be about. Having like cool characters with cool art, like in these amazing situations, doing amazing things. Like instead of like something that manga do, right? Where they establish characters, a unique setting, a world with their storylines that progress, like that slowly unwrap, like instead of like the far superior manga industry, the Western comic book industry seems to think like it's obsessed with this idea of becoming overly political, of making a statement, of like trying to prove to itself that like this isn't kid stuff. And by the only way they can do that, because they can't have like mature, sophisticated writing, okay? Because nobody working on these projects is smart enough for that. Instead, so they just have to have like dudes banging each other. They have to have like gayness everywhere. They have to have all this degeneracy. They have to have all these like all these heroes that are like worse than the villains. You know what I mean? It's like this isn't good storytelling. And it's something that I do think we really do need to address when talking about why shows like The Boys and Invincible don't work. Because we're in this weird phase right now where people are like in denial about this. Because they do this thing where they're like, Invincible is going downhill because of the wokies. It's because of the SJWs. It's because they have a female lead. The Boys is going downhill because like it just keeps like making Trump jokes, like, oh man, it's so woke, oh, this is what's killing the show. Like, the reality is these shows just weren't very good to begin with, and there's this very strong unwillingness from the community to acknowledge it. Like, people will not acknowledge that these shows from the onset were very unoriginal. They were very uninspired. They basically just took the concept of like, what if Superman was evil, and made some like, fan fiction alternate reality based on the concept. Like the guy's last name in Invincible is Grayson. As in like Dick Grayson, Nightwing. It's just like really? You couldn't even come up with your own original last name? That's how like creatively bankrupt you are? Like, it's like, are you serious? Like, how uninspired can you get, bro? And it's like Dispatch is no different, honestly. Like, honestly, in a lot of ways, I would argue that like Dispatch is probably quite a bit worse. Okay? Like, in a lot of ways, I feel as if like this series is kind of the epitome, probably like, we're kind of in like the downward spiral of the superhero thing now. Like, if Invincible and like The Boys was kind of like the beginning of like the decline, where it's like going into like dark, edgy, subversive territory, Dispatch is that, but it's like so much further along that like nobody really even cares about it anymore. And what's interesting about it is that like nobody's really stopping to ask themselves why. This is not a game that's going to be missed on Switch 2. Nobody cares about the censorship. This isn't going to become some major controversy. And honestly, at this stage, I would advocate for Nintendo to like make their censorship policies more clear. Like not having sexual content in M-rated games on their platform is perfectly reasonable. Honestly, games like Baldur's Gate 3, games like this, games like everything else in the market that has sex scenes, like, this is exactly the kind of game that should be rated AO, okay, honestly. But the reason that, like, no publisher will ever go for the AO rating, funnily enough, considering, like, how often they bang up about being mature games for mature gamers, but, like, the reason it never happens is because retailers will not stock the game. They will not promote it. It's something that they really explicitly don't want under any condition. Because, like, funnily enough, rating video games AO just completely kills sales. It's like some cursed thing, really. And what's funny about this is that like there's no real push for that to happen. All you would have to do is like normalize this rating, make these games like completely inaccessible to children, and then like you could probably do whatever you want, right? But like that's not happening. Like the reality is like games like Dispatch, games like Grand Theft Auto, games like series like Invincible, like South Park, like their core demographic are little children. Adults aren't watching this shit. We're reading we're reading real books. We're reading like Fahrenheit 451. We're studying world history. We're learning more about the world. We're applying the sciences in our daily lives. Like we're being cool, mature adults. But like little children are obsessed with being as inappropriate and crass as possible. Like, oh, my mom and dad wouldn't like it if they knew I was playing this. Like this is something that we do need to talk about more in this sense, is that it was perfectly reasonable for Nintendo to censor this Degenerate game, and I will support any further bits of censorship from them. Like, it is time we remove sexually degenerate content from our video games.